Sparks here, and welcome back to the channel. One thing I really want to do on this channel is also share some of my techniques of how I capture images, which also includes night photos. It's now spring, and summer is just around the corner, and Milky Way night photography will be back in full swing before we know it. So in this video, I'm going to dig more into the details of night photography and how I've used certain techniques to capture certain types of shutter speeds in photographs. I'll show you all some multiple second and multiple minute photos in both landscape and railroad, and then explain how and why I used the settings that I did. I hope you all enjoy this tutorial style vlog. Trying to master the art of photography during the light of day is its own difficult challenge, but trying to master the art of photography in extreme low light situations or night scenes is a completely different set of challenges to overcome. One usually requires faster shutter speeds, ranging from 1/50th of a second to 1/2000th of a second or higher, while the other usually requires longer shutter speeds, ranging from 1 second to multiple minutes. Coming up with the proper exposure settings for daylit photographs tends to be a bit easier for an experienced photographer like myself. For example, if I'm at a scene that is mostly lit by the sun and I'm looking to capture everything in the image completely still with no motion blur, my default exposure settings are at about 1/400th of a second with an aperture of f10 and an ISO of around 100. These settings tend to be in the ballpark of what I'm looking to use, but I can slightly adjust the settings from there if need be. Here are a few daylit shots so I can show some examples. This first shot is shot at 1/500th of a second with an f-stop of 10 and an ISO of 250. And for the second example here, I shot it at 1/640th of a second with an f-stop of 9 and an ISO of 200. Now, coming up with exposure settings for night photographs, you have to sometimes get creative. My night work is split between two different types, landscapes and railroads. Of course, both have landscapes in them, but one typically always has moving objects like moving trains. Once I know which type I'm attempting on that night, I can then decide how I'm going to capture my photograph. When I'm going out to shoot landscapes at night, one of the main things I think about is light source. Yes, there are a few different forms of light sources at night. If you choose to be out in moonlit conditions, then longer shutter speeds are not often needed. Here are a couple of examples of night shots in moonlit conditions. For the first example here, it's a moonlit shot of El Capitan high above the Yosemite Valley, with the Merced River below also lit by the moon. For the second example here, it's of the moonlit Yosemite Falls, while the moonlight filters through the trees. To come up with the shutter speeds for these two images was simple. Nothing over 20 seconds to eliminate the star blur from the rotating Earth. I typically go down to 15 seconds to be on the safe side. As for the remaining two settings of the exposure triangle, I simply use the built-in camera light meter to dial in the aperture and the ISO. In this case, it was f4 and ISO 3200. Although do be aware that higher ISO settings will create grainier or noisier images. Both those last images were shot with the exact same exposure settings and are both single exposure photographs. However, many night exposures will require longer shutter speeds that are over 20 seconds, which will require going into an image stacking process to do away with the star blur. When you are out during a new moon phase, like when out catching Milky Way shots, source of light will change. Light becomes harder to catch, so your shutter speeds will begin to get longer, thus creating star blur. This is when image stacking will greatly come into play. For this image here, there were two stacked images, one for the landscape and one for the stars in the Milky Way sky. The Milky Way sky exposure was pretty basic, 20 seconds, aperture of f2.8, and an ISO of 6400. I had to use such a high ISO due to little or no extra light, other than the stars. As for the landscape exposure, I had to try and get the most light out of the scene as I could. I decided with a shutter speed of 3 minutes, with an aperture of f2.8 and a 1600 ISO, trying to balance out the shutter speed and the ISO settings to help prevent softness and graininess in the resulted image. Once the images were created and edited in raw processing, I brought them into Photoshop and used layer masks to blend them together to create the one. Once you venture over to night photography on the railroad, you begin to experiment with many different ways on how to come up with exposure settings, as these shots tend to be longer, multiple minute exposures. The strategy of how I do it may differ from others, but I found it to work nicely for me. Gaining experience over time with calculating exposure settings for multiple minute night photos, I've been able to chart the settings for the different time increments. Let's look at a few images for example. For this 8-minute exposure, I'll be honest, it was a guess as to what the proper settings would be, because I didn't know how long it would take the train to navigate through the curves. So what I did was I watched the train go through first, timed it with my wristwatch, found it was just about 8 minutes, then tried my best to guess the aperture and the ISO settings for the next train. So once it was time to make the 8-minute exposure, I went with what I knew best. It was a moonlit night, so I left the ISO at 100 and tried to leave the aperture at or hovering around f10, like my approach to daytime photography. In this case, I put the aperture at f13 to let a little less light in due to how much moonlight I felt was being casted onto this scene. Once a train showed up, I pressed the shutter button on my remote shutter release device, set my timer on my wristwatch, and waited until the flashing rear end device went through and out of the scene. After the image processed in camera, I was pleasantly surprised to find out my exposure was just about perfect from the information given to me by the built-in camera histogram. To come up with the exposure settings for the second image of just the flashing rear end device, I knew that I only needed the second half of the train, so I simply cut my shutter speed and aperture settings in half. So 8 minutes goes to 4, f13 goes to f6.3. I also upticked the ISO from 100 to 125 just for a slight more light to be brought in, but probably could have even gone up to ISO 200. These experiences while out shooting at night really helped create a database of camera settings for future moonlit images on the railroad. Now all I need to do is guesstimate whether I need to use the 8-minute or 4-minute settings and then execute them. Even if the train only takes 3 minutes or 7 minutes to pass through, I'll still hold the shutter open for 4 minutes or 8 minutes to capture the proper exposure. I also have longer exposure times in the database of up to 14 minutes that I can use as well if needed. Along with exposure times for new moon scenes, here are a few more examples of railroad night images and the different ways I created them. The exposure settings for this image were found using the built-in camera light meter. I was only going for a few seconds of motion blur here, so I decided on 10 seconds to keep the ISO below 1000 to minimize graininess. This one is a 2-image stacked photograph. It was a new moon phase, so there was a little less light than a moonlit night. Although the light pollution in the clouds from the town of Tehachapi and also the light from the Milky Way above helped with exposing the scenery around the railroad tracks. With that extra light, I was pretty much able to treat it like a moonlit scene and implemented the camera settings from the database of an 8-minute exposure for the landscape. However, I did use a little more ISO of 500 to be on the safe side. For the Milky Way sky, I used the basics: 15-second shutter speed, aperture of f2.8, and ISO of 2500. I probably could have gone up to 3200 ISO, but didn't feel like it was necessary. And for the last example here, there are a total of 3 images stacked together to create this photograph. My approach to this shot was different compared to the usual approach. Normally, I'd capture the entire train, headlights, and flashing rear end device all in one long exposure, then make a separate exposure for the sky. However, for this image, I created a series of exposures to make a sequence used for a slideshow, meaning I made multiple 1-minute and multiple 10-second exposures. 1 minute for the headlights, 1 minute for the flashing rear end device, and a couple of 10-second shots for the blur of the freight cars on the train, and then 20-second exposure for the sky. To make the 1-minute exposures, I used the built-in camera light meter for a 30-minute exposure, then simply multiplied the exposure settings by 2 to come up with the 1-minute exposure settings. In conclusion, those are all some different techniques I used to create my night photographs. I feel like they are all very useful tools for my personal workflow, but I am always constantly looking for new, fun ways to be creative. This brings us to the end of my vlog. I hope you've all enjoyed this tutorial style video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Hope everyone has a nice day, and for now, see ya!